You are most welcome to this talk. Now, today I want to examine something that generates enormous controversy and often quite heated debate, and that is the economic dynamics during health crises. Specifically, we are going to look at the data around what some call profiteering from doom, the phenomenon where certain sectors appear to benefit financially during periods of widespread public health concern or crisis. Now, let me be absolutely clear from the outset, this is not going to be a conspiracy video. We are going to look at publicly available economic data, corporate financial filings, and peer-reviewed analysis of market behavior during health emergencies. What we interpret from this data should be based on evidence, not assumption, and certainly not on inflammatory rhetoric. So let me show you what we are going to cover today. First, we will examine what the financial data actually shows about certain industries during health crises. Second, we will look at the methodology problems with how this data is often interpreted. Third, and I think most importantly, we will discuss how to think critically about these numbers without falling into either naive dismissal or conspiratorial thinking. Because the truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in the complexity of the data itself. Now, this is the key question I want you to hold in your mind throughout this entire discussion. When we see a company or sector making significant profits during a health crisis, does that necessarily indicate wrongdoing, or could it reflect the normal functioning of markets responding to increased demand during emergencies? That distinction matters enormously, and the data can help us understand which interpretation might be more accurate in different contexts. Let me walk you through the sources we will be using today. Primarily, we will look at corporate financial filings. These are publicly available documents that companies are legally required to submit. We will also examine data from organizations like the World Health Organization, the United States Securities and Exchange Commission filings, market analysis from reputable financial institutions, and several peer-reviewed papers examining pharmaceutical economics and media economics during health emergencies. Now, these sources have limitations. Corporate filings show what companies report, but interpretation requires understanding accounting practices. Market data can be influenced by factors beyond just crisis response, and observational economic studies cannot establish causation, only association. We need to keep these limitations firmly in mind. Right, so let us look at what the numbers actually show during major health events. If we examine pharmaceutical sector performance during the declared pandemic period, what we see is quite striking. Several major pharmaceutical companies saw their stock valuations increase substantially. Revenue streams associated with vaccine production and therapeutic development generated significant income. Now, I am going to put some numbers on the screen here. According to publicly filed financial statements, some major pharmaceutical manufacturers reported revenue increases in the range of 40 to 60% for their vaccine-related divisions during peak rollout periods. That is substantial. But, and this is crucial, we need to understand what this tells us and what it does not tell us. Now, here is where the methodology becomes important. When we see a revenue increase of, say, 50% in a vaccine division, what does that actually mean? First, it means there was massive demand for a product. That demand was driven by government procurement contracts, which were negotiated at various price points depending on the country. Second, it means the company successfully manufactured and distributed a product at scale. Third, it may reflect the risk premium that was built into contracts given the compressed development timelines. What it does not automatically mean, and this is where much public discourse goes wrong, is that the pricing was inappropriate, that the profits were excessive relative to investment, or that there was deliberate exploitation. Let me show you why this distinction matters with a concrete example. Suppose a company invests $8 billion in developing and scaling up production of a medical intervention. Suppose they generate $12 billion in revenue. That looks like a $4 billion profit, which sounds enormous. But now consider that the investment carried significant failure risk, that similar investments in the past have often resulted in total losses, and that the capital deployed could have been used elsewhere with guaranteed returns. When we factor in risk-adjusted return calculations, the picture becomes more complex. This is not to say the profit was justified or unjustified. It is to say that headline numbers alone do not tell us what we need to know. Now, let me show you another dimension of this that receives less attention but is equally important. Media economics during health crises. If we look at digital advertising revenue data and subscription numbers for major news outlets during periods of heightened health concern, we see very clear patterns. News consumption increases dramatically during crises. This is well documented. Engagement metrics, including time spent on sites, page views, and subscription sign-ups, all increase substantially. For advertising-supported media, this translates directly into increased revenue. For subscription-based media, this translates into increased subscriber bases. Now, here is the methodological point I want to make. Does this mean media outlets have an incentive to prolong or intensify coverage of health crises? The data alone cannot answer that question. What we can say is that the economic incentive structure, whether that incentive actually influences editorial decisions, is a separate question that would require different kinds of evidence to address. What we observe is association. Media revenue increases during crisis coverage. What we cannot conclude from this observation alone is causation, that media outlets deliberately sensationalize coverage to increase revenue. Those are different claims requiring different evidence. This brings me to what I think is one of the most important concepts for understanding this entire topic: the difference between systemic incentives and deliberate conspiracy. A systemic incentive is a structural feature of how markets work. Companies respond to demand. Media organizations respond to audience interest. These responses can have problematic consequences even when no individual actor is behaving unethically. A conspiracy requires coordinated, intentional action to deceive or exploit. These are fundamentally different phenomena, and confusing them leads to confused analysis. Let me give you a concrete example of how this confusion manifests. During the recent global health emergency, there were widespread claims that pharmaceutical companies, government health agencies, and media organizations were coordinating to exaggerate the severity of the situation for profit. Now, what evidence would you need to support such a claim? You would need evidence of coordination, of deliberate exaggeration, and of profit motive driving those specific decisions. What evidence was typically offered? Usually, it was simply the observation that these sectors made money during the crisis, but that observation is equally consistent with the non-conspiracy explanation that they were responding to genuine increased demand during a genuine emergency. Correlation does not establish causation, and profit does not establish wrongdoing. Now, I want to be equally clear about the other side of this analysis. Just because conspiracy claims are often poorly evidenced does not mean that all commercial behavior during health crises is beyond criticism. There are legitimate questions to be asked about pricing transparency, about the terms of government procurement contracts, about the equity of global vaccine distribution, about whether intellectual property protections appropriately balanced innovation incentives against access imperatives. These are important policy questions with significant ethical dimensions. They deserve rigorous analysis, not dismissal, because some poorly evidenced claims have also been made in the same space. Let me show you a specific area where the data does raise legitimate questions. If we look at the pricing of certain therapeutics across different markets, we see substantial price variation that is not easily explained by manufacturing costs alone. For example, certain medications have been priced at dramatically different levels in the United States compared to other high-income countries, sometimes showing price differentials of 300 to 500% for the same product. Now, pharmaceutical companies argue these differentials reflect different regulatory environments, different intellectual property frameworks, and the fact that high-income market prices subsidize research and development costs that benefit everyone. Critics argue the differentials reflect market power exploitation and insufficient price regulation. The data alone does not resolve this debate, but it does identify a real phenomenon that warrants scrutiny. Similarly, if we examine the market for personal protective equipment during the early phases of recent health emergencies, we see documented cases of significant price increases. N95 type masks that previously sold for around $1 were in some cases being sold for $10, $15, or even $20 during peak shortage periods. Medical gowns, gloves, and sanitizing products showed similar price spikes. Now, some of this reflects genuine supply and demand dynamics. When demand increases dramatically and supply cannot immediately respond, prices rise. This is basic market economics. But there were also documented cases of what authorities classified as price gouging, where intermediaries stockpiled supplies and resold them at marked up prices specifically to exploit shortage conditions. Several jurisdictions brought enforcement actions against such behaviour. This is where we need to be careful with our categories. Not all price increases during shortages represent gouging. Some reflect the real costs of rapidly scaling supply, of expedited shipping, of sourcing from alternative suppliers. But some price increases do represent exploitation. The challenge is distinguishing between these, and that requires careful analysis of specific cases rather than blanket judgments either way. Right, let me turn now to something that I think is particularly important for information literacy. How should we evaluate claims about profiteering when we encounter them? I want to give you a framework that I think is useful. First, ask what specific behaviour is being alleged. Profiteering is a vague term that can mean many different things. Is the claim about price levels, about marketing practices, about influence over policy, about suppression of alternatives? Each of these is a different allegation requiring different evidence. Second, ask what evidence is being offered. Is it just the observation that someone made money? Because as we have discussed, that alone does not establish wrongdoing. Or is there evidence of specific problematic conduct, documented deception, demonstrable harm? Third, ask what alternative explanations exist. Could the observed behaviour be explained by normal market responses to increased demand, by legitimate business decisions, by factors unrelated to the alleged wrongdoing? Fourth, consider the source of the claim. Does the person making the allegation have relevant expertise? Do they have a track record of accuracy? Do they have their own financial or ideological interest that might bias their analysis? These questions apply equally to mainstream institutions and to alternative commentators. Fifth, and this is crucial, consider what would change your mind. If you cannot identify any evidence that would lead you to revise your view, that suggests your view is not actually based on evidence but on prior commitment. Good analysis requires being willing to update based on new information. Now, let me be explicit about what we know and what we do not know in this area. What we know: first, certain sectors do see increased revenue during health crises. This is documented in financial filings and is not disputed. Second, the incentive structures of markets can create problematic dynamics even without coordinated wrongdoing. Third, there have been specific documented cases of price gouging and fraudulent marketing of health products during emergencies, and these have resulted in enforcement actions. Fourth, there are legitimate ongoing debates about pricing transparency, intellectual property, and equitable access that deserve serious policy attention. What we do not know. First, we do not know, in most cases, whether specific pricing decisions were appropriate given all relevant factors, because we do not have full visibility into company cost structures and risk assessments. Second, we do not know the extent to which commercial incentives actually influence editorial decisions in media coverage, as opposed to simply correlating with coverage patterns. Third, we do not know whether alternative policy arrangements would produce better outcomes, because such analyses involve complex counterfactuals. Fourth, we do not know how to optimally balance innovation incentives, which require some profit expectation, against access imperatives, which push toward lower prices. This uncertainty is not comfortable, but it is honest. And I think honest uncertainty is more valuable than confident assertions in either direction. Now, I want to address something that often comes up in these discussions, which is the question of trust in institutions. Many people have lost trust in pharmaceutical companies, in regulatory agencies, in media organisations. They see claims of profiteering as confirming their distrust. I understand this response, but I want to suggest a more nuanced framework. Institutions can be flawed without being wholly corrupt. Pharmaceutical companies have produced life-saving medications and have also engaged in problematic marketing practices. Both things are true. Regulatory agencies have provided important public health protections and have also made errors and been subject to regulatory capture. Both things are true. Media organizations have provided essential information and have also sometimes sensationalized coverage for commercial reasons. Both things are true. Recognizing this complexity is not naive, it is accurate. The alternative, treating institutions as either wholly trustworthy or wholly corrupt, makes it impossible to make good decisions. If you assume institutions are always right, you cannot identify genuine problems. If you assume they are always wrong, you cannot benefit from the genuine expertise and resources they contain. Neither extreme serves you well. So what does this mean practically? I think it means we need to develop what might be called calibrated skepticism. Not cynicism that dismisses everything, not credulity that accepts everything, but thoughtful evaluation of specific claims based on specific evidence. It means being willing to criticize institutions when criticism is warranted and to acknowledge value when value exists. It means recognizing that our own biases and prior beliefs shape how we interpret evidence and trying to account for that. Let me close with some practical suggestions for how to think about this topic going forward. If you encounter claims about companies profiteering from health crises, first look for the specific allegations and the specific evidence. Do not settle for vague insinuations. Second, look for alternative explanations and ask whether the evidence distinguishes between them. Third, consider the source and their potential biases, including your own biases in evaluating that source. Fourth, be willing to hold complexity, acknowledging that the same entity can do both good and bad things. If you encounter dismissals of all profiteering concerns as conspiracy theory, apply the same critical framework. What specific concerns are being dismissed? What evidence is being offered for the dismissal? Are legitimate policy questions being conflated with poorly evidenced claims? The goal is not to reach a predetermined conclusion, but to think clearly about complex questions. The economic dynamics of health crises are genuinely complex. Simple narratives, whether of heroic industries saving us or of villainous corporations exploiting us, are unlikely to capture that complexity. The data shows a mixed picture, and our interpretations should reflect that. Now, there is one more dimension I want to address before we finish, and that concerns the relationship between economic incentives and public health outcomes. This is actually a rich area of academic research that I think deserves more public attention. Health economists have studied extensively how different incentive structures affect health outcomes. For example, fee-for-service payment models in healthcare tend to encourage more procedures, not necessarily better outcomes. Capitated payment models tend to encourage efficiency, but may create incentives to avoid complex patients. Neither is perfect. Both have trade-offs. Similarly, patent protection for pharmaceuticals creates incentives for innovation, but also creates temporary monopolies that affect pricing. Shorter patent periods might reduce prices, but might also reduce innovation investment. These are genuine trade-offs without obvious right answers. What this research shows is that economic incentives matter for health outcomes, and getting them right is genuinely difficult. This should make us thoughtful about both defending and criticising existing arrangements. The question is not whether current systems are perfect, they clearly are not, but whether proposed alternatives would actually produce better outcomes. That is an empirical question requiring careful analysis, not a rhetorical question with an obvious answer. I think this is where public discourse often goes wrong. It is much easier to identify problems with existing systems than to design and implement better alternatives. The fact that a company made significant profits does not tell us whether a different arrangement would have produced the same health outcomes at lower cost. It might have, it might not have. The analysis required to answer that question is substantially more difficult than the analysis required to identify that profits were made. This is not a counsel of despair or a defense of the status quo. It is a call for rigorous analysis that matches the complexity of the problems. And I think we all have a role in demanding that kind of analysis from policymakers, from commentators, and from ourselves. Right, let me summarise what we have covered today. We looked at the financial data showing that certain sectors do see increased revenue during health crises. We examined the methodology problems with interpreting that data, particularly the distinction between correlation and causation, and between systemic incentives and deliberate conspiracy. We discussed a framework for evaluating claims about profiteering based on specific evidence rather than vague allegations. We acknowledged both what we know and what we do not know in this area, and we considered the broader question of how economic incentives affect health outcomes. The key takeaway, I think, is that these are genuinely complex questions that deserve thoughtful analysis. Neither reflexive defense of industries nor reflexive condemnation serves us well. The data shows a mixed picture that requires nuanced interpretation, and maintaining that nuance, even when it is uncomfortable, even when simpler narratives would be more satisfying, is essential for making good decisions about our health and our health systems. If you have questions about specific aspects of health economics or want to understand particular data sources better, I would encourage you to speak with qualified professionals who can help you navigate the complexity. There are health economists, public health experts, and medical professionals who have devoted their careers to understanding these systems. Their expertise is valuable even as we maintain appropriate critical perspective on any individual analysis. This video is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not medical advice. If you have symptoms or concerns, please consult a qualified healthcare professional. We use publicly available data and reputable sources, and interpretations may evolve as new evidence emerges. Thank you for watching.